Before we move on to the formal proceedings, a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and video throughout the lecture. Please ensure that you don't touch your device accidentally, that you might activate the streaming option. Questions may be typed into the chat box during or at the end of the lecture. The moderator will raise the question citing your name for the speaker to respond. Now to formally introduce the speaker and for the welcome address, I invite Abdul Basit and the MPhil scholar from the department. Over to you, Basit.
Today we have with us the eminent scholar Dr. Sreejith K, who teaches history at Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam Government College, Kolkata. He did his PhD at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on the topic The Middle Class in Malabar, A Cultural History, 1871 to 1947, and his MPhil research from there on the Naxalite movement in Kerala. Apart from a postdoctoral project on colonizing process in Darjeeling, he has contributed articles in edited volumes as well as in the Economic and Political Weekly and the Social Scientist. His work, The Middle Class in Colonial Malabar, A Social History, published by Manohar, is forthcoming. He has been invited to lecture among other institutes at Delhi School of Economics and Burdwan University. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, and on behalf of all the scholars present here, I welcome you, sir, to deliver the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Basit. Slight clarification in what you said, that the colonizing process in Darjeeling, that was basically an MRP, minor research project. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to Shiba. Thanks to all the other members in the Department of History, Shankaracharya University, for inviting me. And my very best wishes to the two teachers who would be retiring, Dr. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan. Wishing you both a very creative post-retirement life. My topic would be on some aspects of the social history of the middle class in colonial Malabar. There will be two parts to the lecture. Initially, or in the first part, I hope to explore how this home was imagined by the middle class and how far it reflected reality and what went on inside the homes. And in the second part of the lecture, I hope to show the responses of the members of the middle classes to the changes unleashed by colonial modernity. Now, before talking about home or the changes within the home, one should remember the background. The joint family system was collapsing, of which Arunima has done a wonderful work. Not just amongst the Nayars, as others, okay, people like Meera Velayudan and Mahmood Kuria, they have shown how the Samarmakatayam system existed in other communities as well. So there is a big change happening with regard to the breakup of the joint family system. There was a gradual shift to the patrilineal nuclear households. It was not sudden, it was not drastic. Slowly, that the transformation was happening, and both the joint family households and the nuclear households for some time at least would be coexisting. Now, with regard to the imaginings of the home by the members of the middle class, we have sources belonging to this period, including the diary of M.A. Kandat. He is the son of Vengil Kunjiraman Nayanar. Later on goes on to become the one of the first Indian DPIs. So he had a stint of his education in England, and he used to stay in a home, of which he makes an entry in his diary, which you can find at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. So he talks about that home. He talks of how lucky Englishmen are. Okay, and deep inside he's saying that I wish I were an Englishman, talking about the wonderful garden outside, the cozy drawing room with the cozy furnitures, and also this is the kind of imaginings the middle class does with regard to the new home they are visualizing. And in the fiction also you find similar references. For instance, Murkothu Kumaran, in one of his lesser-known novels, Vasumati, he begins a novel with the description of the home or the house of Thea. First of all, he describes a garden, and then he enters the insides of the home. And inside the drawing room, we find this heroine playing a harmonium, and on the other side there is this hero reclining on a sofa with this curtained window behind him. So very similar to what M.A. Kandak was visualizing, because there also he had described some musical instruments, for instance, piano and a gramophone and all inside that home. He remembers in his diary of his stay in England long time ago. So these imaginings we find in the writings of the period. This is not one of. We find a similar kind of description in the writings of Chatu Menon, for instance, in a Nair household this time. The novel is Meenakshi. So not at the beginning, but inside the novel, pages ahead, you find the description of a Naya household. There also you find all kinds of wooden accompaniments, including a bookshelf, of which I'll be talking about later. So this is imaginings. And this was not far from reality. This was actually reflecting the reality, because you find, for instance, in the 1920s, Seluraj, in his book on Kozhikode, talks about the instance where one English sub-judge was looking for a house, and he wanted an English-type bungalow, and he got it from a Muslim, Mamukaya Haji. And the thing is, he did not have to do any furnishing at all, because it was furnished according to his liking, and there was the porch, the veranda, the balcony upstairs, and also a very typical English bungalow the sub-judge got, which you'll find near the civil station in Kozhikode. So this is actually reflecting the reality, the imaginings or the visualization of this home. And what's happening inside the drawing rooms, there again you have evidences of this change. For instance, M.S. Rao, in his study on Malabar in the middle of the 20th century, around 1950, the book comes out. And he talks of the change in the kind of stuff the carpenters were making earlier. He says they used to make all kinds of tools related to agriculture, agricultural tools. But he says there is now a shift to the furniture you find in the middle class drawing rooms, bookshelf and the tea stool, teapoys and all kinds of sofas, etc. So this again is a reflection of the change which is happening. Similarly, you have ads, another source for the period. Advertisement again reflects the kind of furniture, the insides of the middle class homes which are coming into existence during this particular period in time. Then Balamani Amma, she in her memoirs, she talks of earlier days of her childhood when adornments or decorations inside the home was very minimal. At the most, there would be a wooden tobacco box which a mother would be placing inside underneath a cot, or there would be a couple of aluminum pots and all. But later on, when she grows up and she moves out of the traditional home and then lives in a new home, she describes the surroundings totally differently. All the wooden furniture I mentioned earlier, that would be the plus. On the wall, there would be inevitably the painting by Ravi Verma. So Ravi Verma paintings became a feature of the middle class drawing rooms during this period. Now, bookshelf, again, very crucial. Just like during webinars, we now come on webinars, and often we try to have a bookshelf behind us. Today, I couldn't manage because of some logistical difficulties, but this trend has a long history, and it goes back more than 100 years. You find in the photographs of the period, again, photography is again a new invention during this period, and you find several studios coming up in Kozhikode and Telicheri, for instance, there was the Pindo studio, and most of the time the middle class families would be going out to the studios, but occasionally the photographer would be coming home. And on those occasions, you find the middle class men sitting in the drawing room, and behind him, inevitably, there would be this a bookshelf lined with these books. So books became a marker of middle class existence, because It was a time when transport wasn't that easy, traveling wasn't that easy, and it was a kind of window to the world outside. And also, it was a kind of showing your taste. Okay, so books and bookshelves have become very much a feature of the middle class drawing rooms. And again, you have lots of references to that in fiction as well as in the autobiographical and other kinds of writings we find for this period. For instance, in the fiction, Induleka, we know that instance when Surya Nambudripad comes and is stunned by the number of books Induleka has. Similarly, in the other novel, Chandu Menon writes, there again the hero, Keshav Menon, he doesn't buy anything else but books. Okay, he spends money on books and he has around 2,000 books. And he benefits out of that because we find him getting a very good job. And that's what the period demanded of people who were aspiring for government jobs. You learn to read and write and then you get a job. So kind of a message you find from that particular book. So we have fiction and also the writings and the memoirs of people like, for instance, Sanjayan. Sanjayan's biography, actually, Prabhakaran Parshi wrote that biography. And we are talking of a period when electricity had not yet made its presence, except for some areas in a couple of towns in Malabar. Around 1930, in Kozhikode, electricity becomes a reality. And that very slowly, first of all, as street lamps, and then it would penetrate the middle class household. So not everyone was lucky with regard to electricity at home. And this biography talks of Sanjay coming back from a school, rushing back from a school before dark. Okay, before the sunset, he wanted to finish Bhaktamala, which was one of his favorite books. So electricity was slowly penetrating middle class households, but we find in the biography of Sanjay very early on, he was yet to enjoy the benefits of electricity. But he was very much interested in reading, and we also have the writings of Sukumar Alikod. He talks of his father having a library, having more books, far more books than many of the public libraries in the neighborhood. So books and bookshelves, crucial markers of middle class existence during this period. Now, another feature I'll be just briefly mentioning these points because we won't have time to go through all the details. There is this aspect of cleanliness also, which again marks the middle class life during this period, especially for the lower caste, because Sri Narayana Guru had connected, as others had done, with the low casteness. Okay, this uncleanness was connected to this the low status in society. So we find a lot of the middle class Thiyas trying to ensure that the homes are very clean. And about this, we have the study by Dilip Mann also. He also, by making a study of the low caste novels like Saraswati Vijayam and Sukumari, he connects this low casteness and this feeling of being clean. Okay, I mean, trying to become clean, thereby trying to improve your social status. Okay, so those references you have from the writings of this period, and you have also references or sources with regard to the changes which was happening with regard to this attempt to cleanse oneself. P.K.S. Kutti has got a memoir written, Years of Laughter. He talks of how earlier his family used to make use of wakai, which was a kind of a powder made of the bark of trees, and that gradually gives way to soaps. Okay, and he talks of this Lux and other kinds of soaps, and whose advertisement we find in the pages of the magazines produced during this time. So there is this shift from the traditional cleansing agents like wakai to soaps during this period. Now, what was going on inside the homes. That again is crucial to discuss, and that's been discussed in great detail by people like Shiva and all. Shiva, Devika and others, they have talked about the gendering which was going on during this period of time. I'm not going into the details, but just to give some references from the writings of these middle-class men to show that even amongst those so-called progressive men, they had very much internalized the gendering which was going on. For instance, Keshwa Menon in his autobiography, Kalinagalam, he talks of his wife. He says that his wife was only educated up to the 4th standard, and that doesn't matter, he says, because she's a very good cook, and also she does her household work very well. So this man was a Congress leader, editor of one of the more progressive magazines coming from this part of the world. At that point in time, it was quite progressive. So he was editor of Madhrubhumi, but for him, his wife, though uneducated and maybe not adept at the world outside, was very fine for him because he was a man who loved good food, and this woman, his wife, was able to satisfy his hunger as well as hunger for good and tasty food. Similarly, G. Shankaran Nair, his diary is available again in the National Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi. He similarly talks of two kinds of women. I mean, he is criticizing the Western women. I mean, those he calls the modern women. And he says that he's lucky because his wife is not like them, and she does household work very well and is very adept at cooking. So we have these references from the autobiographical writings which indicate the kind of gendering which was taking place. And there is this clear-cut division between the spheres of men and women. Men were to be in charge of the world outside, and women, theoretically at least, were to be in charge of the home, even if the ultimate control would remain with the men folk. So these are two instances to show this kind of gendering happening. And at the same time, one should know that there were exceptions, like, for instance, the daughter of E.K. Krishnan, Janaki Ammal, she was a Tia, and she goes abroad, she goes to America, does a PhD from Massachusetts University, comes back, becomes one of the earliest women botanists in India, later on gets a Padma Shri and also gets a plant named after. So these kinds of exceptions are there. And we know Devika has talked of in the 1930s, women gradually leaving the home, allowed to go home actually, and allowed to do some feminine jobs, including in the health sector and education. But generally, for most people, we find women were confined to this home, especially looking after household work and kitchen. Now, romantic love, again, there is a big debate on that. People like B. Rajivan thinks that the sexualized subjectivity emerges during the period of a colonial modernity, and this caste identity gradually gives way to this sexualized subjectivities because of the segregation in the missionary run schools and the concept of nudity and chastity and the influence of Victorian novels and all. Gradually we find the emergence of romantic love. Maybe it existed earlier, but there is actually this rearticulation or refashioning of this romantic love. And there are these Victorian novels and also the regional language novels imitating the Western novels played a very big part. Okay, so whether it actually existed or not, romantic love in the middle class homes, that again is very much debatable, because we have Meenakshi Mukherjee, for instance, while talking about the English novels and also the Indian variants of these English novels, how there was a disconnect between realism and reality. Okay, realism of these Western novels, where there is this romantic love, but in reality that did not exist in the middle class households. Okay, so it was very much in the imagination. It was a figment of imagination for her. At any rate, we find like then, for instance, the KPS Menon talking of his wife, okay, Chima. That again you find in the Timurti library. This is a diary. There he talks of Chima. He says that the romance which existed earlier, that's gone. The spontaneity is no longer there, and he's struggling with the marital life he was having with the Chima. But he ends like this. He says that why should I be bothered? Because for me there is a world outside. I have far more opportunities to fulfill myself in the world outside. Okay, so this possibility was there for the men folk. Okay, when marriage flops or fails, as in the case of KPS Menon, he had this possibility to fulfill himself in the world outside, but the dual worlds was not possible for the women folk, including his wife. With regard to domestic servants, there is a list of this prescriptive literature, okay, manuals written by people like Murkothu Kumaran, for instance. He wrote a book called Amma Marodu, which was actually a manual for the mothers, telling them what to do and what not to do. And one advice he gives was to not take the help of ayahs in rearing children. Okay, if you allow the ayahs to look after the children, or if you ask the ayahs to raise your children, then your health would suffer, as well as the children's future would become very bleak. Okay, so this tension is between the domestic servant, the ayahs on the one side, against his middle-class men and women. But again, you cannot generalize, because you find in the autobiography of K.V. Musad, he talks of how he was very fond of his ayah. And up to the age of 9, he used to sleep with his ayah. Okay, so he says that he loved his ayah as much as his mother. So these manuals don't always reflect reality. It's not always easy to generalize, because we have these exceptions, as in the case of K.V. Musad. Now, talking about this leisure. Leisure again emerges in the post-industrial period, when the workplace gets segregated from the home. And it's not always the case, because we have the instance of Chandu Menon. He talks of, or his biographer talks of, how he used to come back from the workplace, and at home he was in the judiciary, and at one time was a judge as well. He comes back home and then gets his domestic servants to play the role of the defendant and the victim. Okay, he'll get his family members also into this play. He would act as a judge. So this mock cases would be going on. He would be acting as a judge. So for him, there was no real distinction between the workplace and the home. So these kinds of exceptions you'll find in some cases. And it's a very interesting character. It said that he'll, after the superiors leave the office in the afternoons, he'll get all his colleagues to join him in music and dance sessions. So for him, at least, there was no dichotomy between the workplace and the home. Okay, but generally, sociologists and others, they find that in the post-industrial society, there's a distinction comes into existence. And leisure basically means non-work, or the kind of pleasure and the fulfillment you get during those non-work hours. Okay, so, and again, the feminists have made a critique because of this particular idea regarding leisure, because they show that, or they argue that for the women folk, even if they go out and work, or the housewives, for them the home is also a workplace. So there are some problems with regard to this concept. Leaving that aside, just looking at some of the secular kind of leisure activities which emerge during this period. One is a radio, and radio makes a very tepid beginning in Malabar during this period. 1927, we get newspaper reports, and there it's mentioned how one engineer comes back from Bombay, and he had invited all the neighbors, and they had to buy the tickets also he got money for those tickets, and he's supposed to demonstrate the broadcasting of a radio. Okay, and all of them turn up, but it ends in a flop. He couldn't make the radio function. There was no broadcasting. He blames the signals, like we do sometimes when things go wrong. And he had to refund all the money he had taken from them. So this was the kind of beginning of radio in Malabar, but gradually it picks up. And you find in 1932, around one girl, after an evening at a neighbor's place, who was a doctor, comes back and later writes one piece in the Madhrubhumi of her experience of listening to music over the Bombay radio station. So gradually it will pick up. Earlier it was kept in public places, the radios, like our TV only. Okay, when we were children, I remember when the first TV came, we used to see it from outside, okay, in the public places. Then we'll go to our neighbor's house and then watch TV. And then finally we'll have our own TV. Similar trajectory we find for the radio experience also. This girl is one example who goes out and gets this radio experience and comes back and reports in the form of a piece in Madhrubhumi. So that is one kind of leisure activity. Just some I'll be mentioning. Another would be Adda, ADDA, Bangla word actually, and which Deepesh Chakravarti has written about. It's basically non-formal, non-serious talk, okay, between friends and relatives. I don't know what would be the exact Malayalam word, maybe Khati, I'm not sure. But this Adda becomes a feature of middle class existence during this period. People having similar interests and mostly doing the same kind of job, they'll be getting together to have these discussions. Kamala Das, in her autobiography, she talks of while she was staying in Palakkad, her father's friends turning up in the evenings. We'll have discussions, and this would continue well into the nights. And sometimes these friends would be staying back. So Adda picks up, and then you have C. Krishnan having as a friend C. Manjari Sundarayar, his lawyer friend. He used to be a regular visitor to his home. Then this owner of Kottakkal, Aryavedishala, P.S. Warrior, his biographer says was a wonderful host and used to entertain guests and have these long discussions with them. So Adda could be seen as another kind of leisure activity during this period. Now, coming to the world outside, what happens outside the home? The towns, the two principal towns during this period were Tellicherry and Kozhikode, and there is a socio-economic history connected to its growth, how they were linked to the world economy while they became part of the colonial imperatives. But no point going into that. And the thing is, I mean, there were no big cities in Malabar, but there was Madras. Okay, and the Madras was closely linked to Malabar. Okay, it was almost like an extension of this region. We have most of the middle class characters I'm talking of. Okay, they had some kind of link with the Madras. For instance, Keshava Menon, he goes to get his wife treated, for giving medical treatment to his wife. C. Krishnan and Sanjayan, they would go to Madras, get educated and come back. And there are others like C. Krishnan Nair and Mulil Krishnan. They would settle down in Madras. Okay, and they'll have relatives coming over, staying for long periods of time. And with the advent of railways, they would be coming for family occasions. So Madras became almost like an extension of this region. And with regard to these towns and the cities, you have the middle class having an ambivalent attitude. Okay, I mean, two kinds of ways they were looking at the. I mean, it's not a very uniform way they were looking at these cities. The perception varied according to individuals and sometimes within the same individual. There was on the one side this perception of the city as a site of vices. Okay, and since, like for instance, you have this short story written by Vengil Kunniraman Nayanar. He talks of one fraudster cheating the protagonist. The name of that short story is Madirashi Pittalatam. So these kinds of stories abound during this period with regard to the cities. Okay, S.K. Pattakad also talks of, his own personal traumatic experience at the hand of a fraudster while he went to Mumbai. Okay, so these things are the, and with regard to the Kozhikode town, you have in the Kerala Sanchari, Kerala Patrika and all, you have references to the dangers the city posed or the town posed. Okay, they talk of how most parts of the towns were having brothels, and there were these so-called fallen women all over the place, which make it very scary to go to some parts of the town in the night. So that part is there, but at the same time, towns are also seen in very positive light, especially with regard to the lower caste. We know Dilip Menon's work, okay, how he reads Saraswati Vijayam, where you find the low caste finding in the cities less of the caste hierarchy. So at least there is a dilution of the horrendous caste hierarchies, which was very much prevalent in early part of the 20th century in Malabar. So for them, this city was a venue or a site of emancipation. Not just for the lower caste, we have references from the upper caste also. One P. Narayanan Nair later becomes a journalist. He comes back from Madras and is very unhappy the day he's coming back. He talks of the wonderful evenings he spends in the city of Madras, okay, going to cafes and meeting friends and all. So these dual approaches are this ambivalence, which again could be a product of the fractured nature of our modernity, which people like Sanjay Joshi has talked about. Okay, that's why you have a Paramodi Parinam written against Indulega, but at the same time you have the author of Indulega taking dual positions on similar issues at different times. He is very much for all kinds of modern changes in his novel, but when it came to the Malabar Marriage Bill, we know what he said. He says if the nephew brings home one pariah wife, what would happen? Okay, so these dualities, these ambivalences, you find plenty in the writings of the middle class intellectuals during this period, and this is very much a product of the fractured nature of the modernity we had to go through. Now, coming to railways, again, very interesting history possible with regard to the railways, the socio-economic context, the recruitment policies, and all kinds of stuff. But here I'm just giving instances in the writings of the middle class men to show the kind of responses they had to the railways. Okay, and initially there was opposition. They didn't like what was happening. And once it became inevitable, they began to criticize. Like, for instance, they talk about the third-class compartments. People had to carry umbrellas during the rainy season. And they also talk of the racial discrimination. If you as much as peep into the first class compartment where the English travelers would be sitting, you would be immediately punished. So that critique part is there. But once it became inevitable, they start to try and mold its growth or the direction it would be taking. So we find different kinds of demands being made. For instance, there is a demand from the men of Tiruvangad, and Tiruvangad is still is and was the bastion of upper caste of that particular town. And the demand was there should be a railway station at Tiruvangad, okay, because otherwise the women folk is finding it difficult to travel by the trains. Then another instance, we temple adjacent to it, and that should be shifted, but this time the government does not agree to the proposal. And you also have even stranger demands. For instance, the argument was that the night trains, okay, local night trains were helping the thieves and robbers to come to the towns do robbery and then go back. So the timing of the night train should be changed because it was making it easier for the thieves to rob from the towns and go back to their home. So all these things happen. And one last instance with regard to the railways I'll mention just to show the kind of pervasiveness railways had in our lives. Okay, Tikodian in his autobiography, Arangu Anatha Nadan, he talks of an instance when he was young, he was a teacher in a school. The inspector of a school comes along, and unfortunately for the school, the clock was not working. And the inspector asks, "And how do you manage to run the classes?" Okay. Then the principal responds by saying that we depend on the train timings. Okay, when the train goes to the north in the morning at 10 o'clock, we start our class, and in the evening at around 4 o'clock, when the train goes to the south, we disband the classes. So presumably at that point in time, Indian Railways must have been punctual, otherwise this thing could not have worked. Okay, finally, I'll come to a few references to friendships cutting across caste and race. There is this instance in the novel A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, where one character says that it's not possible during the colonial period to have friendship between the whites and the Indians, unless and until this colonialism ends, no possibility. Okay, but we find at least references to embryonic friendship between the whites and the locals in Malabar during this period. I'll just mention a few instances and wind up. There was this good relations between the English and the K's, the business family from Tellicherry. Originally, they were from Kannur, but they settled down in Tellicherry. So they had a good equation, and the English East India Company used to take money from the Key family. And the good relations is indicated by the fact that when the K's got into trouble with the planter, Murdoch Brown, the English East India Company actually sides with the Key family. So that's an example of the kind of friendship which existed initially, but later on, when East India Company got entrenched, they got established and had no need for the case. And when the case were not updating their businesses, you find them, the English East India Company not having any time for the case. This apart, there were some individual friendships. For instance, Chandu Menon, and we are talking of a time when there was this tension, okay, in the offices and elsewhere between the whites and the locals, especially after the arrival of clock time and all. Okay, especially with regard to the subordinates, they get into all kinds of problem. That's but in spite of that, we find this instance of friendship. Okay, so he was a good friend of Dumug, and Dumug actually translates Indulega and thereby gives this Indulega a wider audience. And his second novel, Sharada, Chanduman actually dedicates to this Dumug. Okay, and Vikram, another Englishman with whom Chandu Menon had a good friendship, and also E.K. Krishnan, his Satya friend. They were good friends with the Vikram, the district judge. And after Vikram leaves the town, both of them, E.K. Krishnan and Chandu Menon, they institute a prize for the best student at Kerala Vidyalaya, which later on becomes the Guru Ayyappan College. Okay, so one gold ring would be given by these two collectively in the memory of Vikram. Then Churai Kanaran, he was a Tiya, he became the sub-collector of Ponnani. On his death, William Robinson, the collector, he writes an obituary where he says that Churai Kanaran was the best friend he had in India. And we also have the instance of Karunagara Menon, who played a part in the capture of Parashi. He was a good friend of the English, and when Captain Walsh arrives in Kozhikode, this man Karunagara Menon was staying in Ramnatuyara, and we find Walsh going there, and they together going for this hunting expedition. Now, with regard to the inter-caste friendships, Remember here you have a lot of lower caste being part of the group we call the middle class. Unlike, for instance, Bengal, where this middle class identity was created more or less othering the Adivasis, the lower caste, and the Muslims. Here you have the Nayars, and that to the lower strata of the Nayars. The upper strata and the Nambudiris, initially at least, they turned their back to English education because they were the privileged groups in the earlier system. But the low class, or the low strata Nayars and the upper strata Tiyas, they constituted, I mean, there were obviously other communities as well, but these two constituted the major component of the middle class group in Malabar. And there was a context also. The Tiyas, they had this cultural capital. All of them, as Ayyappan would later try to argue, once, I mean, the Tiyas made some advancement, he would try to disown toddy tapping as the occupation of the Tiyas and the Iravas. But apart from toddy tapping, they also engaged in a traditional teaching. There were traditional teachers amongst them. Some were Ayurvedic practitioners, some were into martial arts. So they had this cultural capital. And more importantly, especially in places like Kannur, they had this very close, intimate ties with the English. Okay, so that could have provided the opportunities for them to make use of the openings which were now made available during the colonial era. So we find lots of friendships happening between the two members of the two castes. A few examples I'll give. One, E.K. Krishnan was a great friend of Chandu Menon. And Chandu Menon's biographer is Murukotu Kumare. He talks of the great friendship E.K. Krishnan had with Chandu Menon, how they both enjoyed hunting, so on and so forth, apart from their interest in literature. Then K.T. Chandu Nambiar was a very close friend of Murukotu Kumare. And they had the difference again on literary matters. They brought out two different literary magazines, and they used to argue non-stop, but they were close friends. And when there was this Shashti Purti of Murukotu Kumare, this Mangala Patra was actually read by K.T. Chandu Nambiar. And earlier I mentioned the C. Krishnan having close ties with the Manjeri Sundaraya. So these inter-caste friendships were gradually becoming the reality. But this was only one side of the story. There are, of course, fault lines, and deep inside we find tension still simmering. One, two examples I'll give. You find Murukotu Kumaran, for instance, lamenting secretly. I mean, his son Murukotu Kunyappa writes a biography of Murukotu Kumaran. The Murukotu Kumaran is supposed to have been very sad that in the whole novel of Hindu Lega, there's not the mention of a single Tiya. Okay, so that's supposed to have hurt him. And you also have the case of Mulil Krishnan. He was a teacher at Presidency College in Madras. He had Nair friends. And his biographer talks of how his Nair friends would come to his home, have food and go back. But they would be wary about others coming to know about that. So these caste tensions remain, even if outwardly they had these possibilities of friendship. I'll wind up with the case of C. Krishnan. He was a banker, he was a publisher, he was a lawyer. He had material success, but ultimately we find him becoming a Buddhist, possibly because he found that he was not getting the social respect he thought he deserved after becoming materially successful. So I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, maybe I can try to answer.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So we have come to the end of the keynote address. So it was indeed a very enlightening section. He told us very... Okay. Okay, sir. Sir, can I continue?
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So he told us very clearly about how the middle class, which has its root in colonialism, emerged and spread over the household of Malabar, citing examples from very basic amenities that include furniture, electricity, etc. And he also explains this advent of new middle class in Malabar with several references drawn from various literature. And he also gave us a clear picture on the notion regarding concept like gender, leisure, and cleanliness, and how it's intrinsically linked to the emergence of the new class in this area. Uh, it was very interesting. He talks about how these changes are too visible in our surroundings, caste, race, towns, and transport. So very thank you so much, sir. Sir, shall we go to the next section for the discussion?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the floor is open for the discussion.
Ramisa, can you read out the questions?
Yeah.
Dr. Sri, can you see the questions or should the questions be read out to you?
Okay, I'll go to the chat box now.
Yes, can you? Or do you want it to be read to you?
I can try.
Maybe we could read out to you.
Sir.
Since your video has been switched off, you can switch on your video. Ramisa, could you do that?
Yeah, sure. So first question is from Jelena Anthony, who is a research scholar from our department. She is asking, colonial modernity has redefined many concepts, including the notion of time, ambition, success, etc. What are the different sort of conflicts that the middle class experienced while adapting to these changing notions? Am I clear, sir?
Yeah. There is a shift to, can you hear me? Or I'll take it off.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, when this shift happens to clock time and the standardization of time, there is obviously trauma cost, especially for those working as subordinates in the offices where the whites were the superior officers. And but unlike Bombay there were riots also. That doesn't happen in Malabar, but this tension keeps simmering in the offices. But at the same time, you find certain individuals like our Keshwa Menon and C. Krishnan internalizing the values of punctuality, which I mean the colonial regime were trying to circulate here. I mean, for them, the Indians were lazy. They needed to be disciplined. And there was a need for proper management of time. So this was internalized by people like Keshwa Menon, for instance. C. Krishnan, if you read their autobiographies and biographies, you find that they kept very distinct time hours for everything, from morning walk to the times they had a breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the afternoon nap, and also the meetings they had in the evenings, because they thought that Britain had become a great nation, mainly because they gave importance to punctuality. They understood the value of time. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. So you have such individuals also internalizing the Western values. And with regard to ambition, I mean, what this was people, Keshwa Menon and what this but at the same time, you should not entertain the rat race, which was also have colonial menu. So there should be a balanced track. So you find a lot of successful men during the faceted personality in different walks of life. They were a success. Mukothu Kumaran used to be a writer plus a teacher. Sanjayan used to teach at a he was a writer as well. So ambition is okay, but it shouldn't be ultimately leading to this rat race. Okay, and this is not. I mean, one should be ambitious. One should be
Dr. Sreejith, your voice is breaking. It's fine.
It's better, I think. No? Can you hear?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. The trouble is, if I take it out, I can't hear. Okay. When I speak, I'll take it off.
Yes.
I was talking about these individuals giving importance to time and legitimizing ambition if it's the right kind of ambition and not ending up in a rat race and all. But with regard to communities also, they were talking of the Nambudiris, many of them who were living on inherited wealth. Okay, so many of the writings in Uni Nambudiri, for instance, you find criticizing the kind of life these Nambudiri men were leading, and they were saying that if this continued, we'll be parasites and we can never catch up with the other communities. So the new and a standard time, okay, clock time, created trauma, but there were those who internalized and understood its value and made the best use of it. That's the answer I can give.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question from Meenu Rebecca on behalf of Elsa, doctoral candidate SSUS. Her first question is, what was the role of Christianity in redefining the notion and experience of leisure? And the next question is, can we consider the emergence of Rotary Club and YMCA as a form of associational leisure?
I think we can have one question at a time, Ramisa.
Okay.
Okay, this is a Christianity one. No? Okay, there is this concept of Sabbath in Christianity. And that's very much linked to what leisure actually means, because Sunday, one rest day after 6 days of week. And ultimately, India ended up having Sunday as the holiday, late 19th century onwards. So there you find this Christian influence, because leisure in its narrow definition is a non-work. Okay, Sunday, there is no work, and that's the time for rest. And also you have in the biblical literature references to feasting, for instance, from very early on, when David defeats the Philistines. Okay, so that long tradition is of feasting. Then there is music and singing, dancing. And Jesus Christ had a lot of friends. So that socialization part is... so all these things are there. And in the churches, if you go on Sundays and other occasions, you'll have these moments of socialization. Okay, and you have gradually Christian migrants coming to Malabar during this period. And conversion was also happening. The number of Christians is going up. So that influence obviously would be there, but very difficult to quantify, okay? Because feasting, singing, dance, socialization, all of which we consider parts of leisure, that's there in other religions also, okay? So earlier societies also had these things. So how much Christianity impacted in that sense, very difficult to answer. And I was basically talking about non-religious secular leisure, because we have in the Hindu communities also earlier period religious-based leisure activities. Okay, like for instance, at home somebody might read the Puranas. Okay, so that is a kind of leisure at that point in time. But I was basically talking about the change to more secular, non-religious kinds of leisure activities. And about the Sabbath one, just instance, Vipin Paul's one video I was listening to, that is a program run on Asianet, I think. Just very briefly, I was listening to. he talks of slavery, the slave trade, and he talks of a church in Kochi, which used to be used as a go-down for keeping the slaves 6 days of the week. And on Sunday, there would be mass and religious congregation, and also 6 days kind of the work was going on. So, I mean, not blaming Christianity, this is there in all kinds of religions. So that part is also just came to mind. Okay, so what's the next question?
Next question is, can we consider the emergence of Rotary Club and YMCA as a form of associational leisure?
Okay. Well, then you have to talk about the clubs in general. During the period I am discussing, the colonial period, the clubs basically cater to the whites. Okay, and this continues nearly up to the 1930s and 40s. 1930, I think, in Tellicherry, the Cosmopolitan Club became a new Cosmopolitan Club. Earlier it was whites-only club. It becomes possible for the Indians to join in around 1930. Okay, so this is, I mean, the kind of clubs which existed during the colonial period. Even the Rotaract Club you mentioned, Gandhi goes to a meeting of the Rotaract Club, and he's addressing a meeting only whites are there. Okay, much later in Kochi, Shanmugan Shetty, he becomes the president of the Rotary Club there, but that happens later. And even this person and others like him, I mean, they belong to the elites, not necessarily middle class. Only in the post-independence period, maybe you can talk of the middle classes enjoying this club culture. And it was very much a leisure activity, but it catered to a particular segment of the society. I mean, there are exceptions, like, for instance, Benjamin Cohen has worked on interracial clubs, especially ladies' clubs in places like Nilgiris, for instance, where membership was open to the ladies also. But that again was, the Indians allowed their way basically of the elite section. And there were some clubs in some parts of India which were sponsored by the Maharajas, but on the condition that he would be the only Indian in the club. So these had very limited role as far as the ordinary middle class had. Ordinary middle class were concerned with regard to leisure activities. And with regard to the kind of shift which happens with regard to Rotary and YMCA talked of, leisure in its very narrow sense is not doing work, okay, taking rest. But in its broader sense, it also means the kind of spiritual upliftment you get, the kind of pleasure you can get out of doing something in those free hours. So Rotary gives a lot of importance to charitable work. YMCA has that Christian connection. YMCA has that Christian links. So, and there again, if it's a spiritual upliftment you are getting, doing some kind of work associated with the YMCA, that again is a kind of a leisure activity. And charitable work also, it's not part of your office work. You are finding some free time and doing some kind of charitable work. So maybe charity and spiritual upliftment, that could be two of the new maybe ideas which came into the concept of leisure with the involvement of Rotaract and YMCA.
Okay, so her last question is, the tensions of moving between the two worlds must have been felt most actually by women. How were this marked and how this data captured?
Okay. Well, not too many sources I could get my hands on. There are people like Shiba, Devika, they must be doing a lot of work in that respect. Mine was not that much focused on the gendering part, but little bit is there. So I did consult some sources. I'll come to that later. There is this instance in Madhurabhumi, in the history of Madhurabhumi, actually, in its early years, one Savitri Andrajanam. She used to write one column. Later, it turned out that it was actually, a man who was writing in the name of Savitri Andrajana. So this was the kind of time we are talking of, and some this Sri Samajans and women's magazines come up, but they again conform to what patriarchy dictated. They never questioned the roles women had to play. For instance, one of the earlier magazines, I don't remember the name, it clearly mentioned that religion and politics we won't be discussing. Okay, and carried articles which would help, which would help these women to become good housewives. Okay, so that's the kind of period we are discussing. In the reports on education, okay, of the district, you have references to a lot of girl students going to a new school, but unfortunately, it doesn't end up in employment. Okay, just like Indulekha was educated to become a good housewife in the novel, and Madhavan's education was geared to find him employment. You find the same thing happening in reality also. Okay, so again, so that's a kind of a source. Okay, I mean, there's reports on education and all, and then you have some autobiographies and fiction. Indulekha, I mentioned. Then there is this many years later, the wound of spring, the character Parukuti Amma, she goes out, okay, and does work as a music teacher, but she's isolated for that. Okay, so this is happening, and not just in fiction. In reality, you have Kamala Das talking of inner autobiography. I mean, Kamala Das, her writings and her life was a kind of a questioning of what patriarchy was dictating. But in that autobiography, she talks of one neighbor. She ended up becoming a spinster. Nobody was willing to marry because she was too much educated. Okay, and then there is this autobiography of Revati Amma. Okay, and she was the wife of a police commissioner in Mahi. Okay, she was a housewife, but she tries to go out and work and does some charitable work. But even that was criticized, not just by family members, but by the neighborhood in general. So in combination with the government sources, fiction and autobiography, maybe you can get a sense of what's happening with regard to gendering. Only 3 diaries I went through, all men, kept in the Timurti library.
Okay, sir. There is one more question from Jelena Anthony. She is asking, how has the new normal of work from home changed and redefined the historical boundaries of home and the world?
Okay. Okay, it's not a temporary phenomenon, it seems, because the big giant IT companies have decided that this would be the work mode in the years to come, work at home. So it's going to have a lasting impact. But others like us will have to go back to work, and maybe some digital work and work at home, that would be part of our lives in the future in other professions. But with regard to this, how is it impacted the gendering? Maybe it's given some legitimacy to the kind of work women does. Okay, women do while going out and then coming back to do work at home, or I mean the housewives. That was never respected earlier, but now you have the men folk also doing the same thing. Maybe this will give some legitimacy to the work women does. But whether it's really empowered women, hard to say. I don't think so, because you have domestic abuse cases going up tremendously during the lockdown. And unless and until the decision-making powers are shared with the women, and as she becomes financially, independent, I don't think there would be any sea change.
Okay, sir. Next question is from Swarna Suresh, doctoral candidate from SSUS. Her first question is, how do you perceive the relationship between the middle class group deprived socially and historically compared to the so-called dominant middle class in the class hierarchy?
Can you repeat, because just once more?
Okay, sir, okay.
1 second.
Please.
How do you perceive the relationship between the middle class group deprived socially and historically compared to the so-called dominant middle class in the class hierarchy?
Okay, whether
I think the question is whether this class and the caste collide. Generally, that's the case, but there could be exceptions also, because the socially deprived sections in some parts of Malabar, they were financially well off also. But these are very rare, and generally speaking, this class and caste more or less coincided. I hope it answers.
Okay, sir. Her next question is, class imagination are very vibrant in fiction. But in historical studies, how do we segregate caste from class?
I think the same question, no?
Yes, sir. I think so too.
caste class, no? Caste and class too, no?
Class imagination are very vibrant in fiction, but in historical studies, how do we segregate caste from class?
You mean a class imagination is vibrant? Class.
Yes, class and caste.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. The thing is,
the middle class is not in that sense very much connected to the production process, okay? And they don't have the same kind of economic interests like the working class. But at the same time, if you're talking of middle class consciousness, you find during this period they are sharing similar concerns for the way the state and the society and law should be organized. They have a similar cultural taste, okay? And I think these in a way somehow help in creating a kind of class consciousness, even though in comparison to the working class, it's a very slippery category. And you have different layers, different stratas. Some might come down to the lower level of the working class, and some might climb up the ladder and become the upper class. Okay, so the borders are very porous, but they are not totally without class consciousness, I feel.
Okay, sir. Her last question is, does the expansion of middle class from urban centers imply a major shift in India's political culture and social values?
Once more?
Does the expansion of middle class from urban centers imply a major shift in India's political culture and social values?
Well, I can talk about the period I'm discussing. They were the real cultural entrepreneurs, actually. Numerically, not that many, but they control the cultural destiny of a region. Okay, I'm talking of Malabar in the colonial period. So, because they dominate the teaching field, they are in the intelligentsia, and all kinds of media are controlled by them. So, in that sense, I think they can really determine the way India would be going culturally forward.
Okay, sir. Next question is from Nivedita K. This is in connection with your mention about the drawing room and the insights of the new family in the making. Is the redefinition of the public or private spaces affecting the architectural plans of the new household?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this earlier that Tarwad type of houses exist, but it's gradually shifting to the new English type bungalows. I mean, the richer ones, they could afford to construct those kinds of bungalows with that veranda porch and all those features. But that's it. I mean, it's happening. That's what I said in the fiction of the times. And also I talked of M.S.A. Rao and all. I mean, the kind of, the furniture that's being made by the carpenters and all that show the kind of shift to the new kind of homes, which is happening in Malabar during this period.
Okay, sir. Next question is from Agil A.R., who is a PhD candidate from JNU. Can we perceive the emergence of middle class in Malabar as political with regard to British colonial advent, or was it economical in nature?
Economically?
Economical in nature.
I mean, it was clearly a product of the changes which were happening in the society. I mean, you're talking of the emergence of the middle class, no? If I heard you correctly, I'm not very sure. I'm not hearing properly.
Emergence of middle class in Malabar.
Emergence, yes. No? Okay. I mean, it's a product of
emergence
that
of middle class in Malabar. Yeah.
Okay. For instance, I mean, this land becomes a saleable commodity. It becomes necessary to register the process of selling land. Marriages needed to be registered, so registration offices come into the picture. There is a land litigation happening all across Malabar, and said that in Malabar, the maximum number of land disputes were happening. So the courts come into the picture, okay, and the whole legal infrastructure, the vakils, the judges, and so on. And you find that reflected in the literature of the time. Sharada, the second novel of Chandu Menon, is basically talking about the court life. Okay, so and these are the people who are constituting the middle class, and there is expansion of the print culture in the 19th century, the newspaper editors and all, and they were very much the segment of the middle class. I mean, the earlier Nateluthu, they don't exist anymore. The expansion of English education create the condition where the English teachers come into the picture. Okay, so these things are happening. And also you find new commercial ventures coming onto the scene, English shown, then German Basel missionaries, they also started these tile factories and all. Some native industries also come up. And there was a need for this managerial class also. So it's a combination of all these factors which created this middle class. Okay, there is a, expansion of the government service also, the bureaucracy. Indians were being taken into the government service. And you find the Indians, Diyas, Nayas, occupying the posts of judges, sub-judges, even magistrates. Okay, so the bureaucracy, then the different professionals, the intelligentsia, these are some of the components of the middle class.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is from Shobha Karinjan. What are the approaches and attitudes of these middle classes towards Western medicine, modern medical practices like vaccination?
Okay, I can
Of two people, how they responded to the vaccination. One is Sanjay and the other one is EMS Nambudipad. In their autobiographical writings, you find as children, when the vaccinators used to come, they used to go and hide. Okay, so that was the kind of attitude they had. That's what native fear was with regard to vaccination at that point in time. And with regard to allopathic medicine, we have there's a Kotakal Aryaveda Shala trying to modernize itself, because that's the only way to survive at that point in time. I think Ken Panikar has an article on that. You can't live in the past. We have to, not give up totally the traditional methods of making medicine and all, but in the organization, in the way it's structured and all, okay, better lab facilities and all, you have to take up what the West had to offer. Okay, and that's it.
Yeah, the next question is, Ramisa's call has dropped, so I'm reading the questions now. It's from Salina. How far colonial modernity enabled women to take decisions themselves, cutting across the barriers of caste and social divisions, especially in marriage?
How far? I'm sorry, I'll better wear this thing.
How far?
Once again, Shri.
No, it's okay. Yeah. How far? Can I?
yeah.
How far colonial modernity enabled women to take decisions themselves, cutting across the barriers of caste and social divisions, especially in marriage? Dr. Sreejith, are you there?
Yeah. In the period we were discussing, they hardly had the choice. But again, there are references. For instance, there is one Gladys Ampat, AMBAT Ampat. She writes a piece in the Brennan College magazine in the 1930s, late 1930s, 1939 to be exact. And there she, talks of how this caste and class, those barriers no longer exist for us. And that's a sign that it was breaking down, at least in the campuses. And C.H. Kunyappa, he studied in Brennan College around the same time. He also talks of similar instances of love marriages happening. So these love marriages must have happened, but for the most part, even now we know, women hardly have the choice in deciding their life partner. So forget about that time, but these exceptions were there.
Thank you. Maybe the last question from Jayanti Chami. Rise of middle class is an important phenomenon in the social historical perspective. The middle class concept or rise of middle class, how helped to reduce caste class consciousness?
Yes, once more.
How, the rise of the middle class or the middle class concept helped to reduce caste class consciousness?
Middle class means one class, even if there are stratas within that category. But as I talked of, in those instances, you find these friendships and all happening, cutting across the caste lines. Okay? That's why I gave those instances. But I ended by saying deep inside, these fault lines never totally disappeared. Okay? So Compared to the past, obviously, it's becoming more possible to work and even love in some cases across caste lines, but not totally. Okay.
Thank you for that. I think we have come to the end of the questions. Now I would invite Sitara to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to present the vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sreejith K.
Sitara, have we lost you? Sitara?
for delivering a very informative and intriguing lecture, and especially thank him for taking time out from his busy schedule to grace this occasion. Thank you, sir. I sincerely thank all the participants for being here and elevating this session with
Sitara, I think your mic is muted, Sitara. Can you check that, Sitara? Yes, please continue. Yes, please continue. Your mic was muted in between.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to present the vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sreejith K. for delivering a very informative and intriguing lecture, and especially thank him for taking time out from his busy schedule to grace this occasion. Thank you, sir. I sincerely thank all the participants for being here and elevating this session with your valuable response. Thank you again to each and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitara. Thank you all for attending this session. Thank you, Dr. Sreejith, for this very, very interesting session. I hope we meet again. Yes, thank you. We will have our next lecture.